Okay. Welcome everybody, both in the room and joining us virtually. This is our 2022 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. If we haven't met, I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Interim Graduate School Dean, Associate Dean for Environmental Programs, and Professor of Law at Vermont Law School. And we're very pleased to welcome you here today. Every Tuesday and Thursday in August, we have a presentation in this series. And if you're looking for CLE credit, you can obtain 1 Vermont CLE credit for this talk. If you're in person, you would just need to sign in on the roster in the back, and we just ask that people keep track of the talks for your own CLE records. We will have time for questions after the talk today. For those that are joining us virtually on YouTube or Facebook, we will be monitoring the chat. So we welcome your questions or comments through the chat on those 2 platforms, and we will pose them or share them with the speaker during the Q&A session at the end. But feel free to put them in there anytime, and we'll keep track. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor David Wirth. Professor Wirth is a professor of law at Boston College Law School, where he serves as has served. Are you currently serving as Director of International Programs? Has served. He teaches environmental, administrative, public, international, and foreign relations law. Taught me environmental administrative law, one of my best classes in law school. He previously served as senior attorney and co-director for international programs for the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, as well as an attorney advisor for oceans and international environmental and scientific affairs for the U.S. Department of State. He's the author of more than 6 books, articles, and reports on international environmental law and policy for both legal and popular audiences. He's a graduate of Yale Law School. He holds an undergraduate and graduate degrees in chemistry from Princeton and Harvard, respectively. So he's a real dummy, and we're doing him a big favor by letting him speak here. He's been teaching at Vermont Law School in the summer for 31 years in the summer session. And next month, he's teaching the course, The International Law of Food, to our students here. Today, his talk is titled International Environmental Law and the War in Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Wirth.
Virtual hug. Thank you very much, Jenny, for that very kind introduction. By my count, this is at least my 9th Hot Topic presentation during the summers. It's an honor to be here again. Either in the Hot Topics series or in the predecessors to it. As I was looking at my own slide, I thought, oh, I should have worn that yellow shirt. I have half of the Ukrainian flag, the blue jacket, but not the yellow shirt. In fact, when the Putin's special military operation began, I was wearing blue and yellow to class every day. I just somehow got out of the habit, so you can imagine this as I saw the yellow shirt. It's a particular pleasure to be here today because I get to speak to you out of a portion of my brain that doesn't really fit into the introduction that Jenny gave, but that is also very important to my personal and professional development, namely as a sometime Soviet area and Russia specialist. So, for instance, Jenny introduced me as being associated with the Oceans, Environment, and Science Office at the State Department. As you'll see in just a second, I also have a background dealing with Soviet affairs. So, just before I start, this PowerPoint was the longest night's journey into day ever known to humankind. And so I wanted to thank both Sherry Chen and also Salman Sarwar, who saved me from any number of circles of PowerPoint hell. So first of all, just so you know how I happen to be here today speaking about this topic. I originally started Russian language when I was out of a job in the summer after my freshman year of college. Down the road a piece at Middlebury College, and this was my first teacher, David Sloan. So he had studied Russian language and been to the Soviet Union, and then married a Russian woman, Tanya. And so I actually just started on a whim. I didn't have a job, And I expected at this point to be standing, not here at Vermont Law School, but in the basement of some laboratory, as Jenny described, running some experiments. So I started Russian language at Middlebury with David Sloan. And one of the interesting things that changed my life. Then I came back to college in the fall and met this lady, Veronika Dolenko, whose father had been on the pre-revolutionary Duma. If you pay close attention, you can see that these references date me quite a bit. So this goes back several decades more than I care to admit. But one interesting thing about her name is this K-O, which is characteristic of Ukrainian names. Now, I'm sure that this woman never in her life identified herself as Ukrainian, but it just shows the mixing of nationalities, what Russians would call nationalities, in the former Soviet Union. So, for instance, when I went there as a student, I was asked, what is your nationality? I would say American, United States, and they would say, what's your real nationality? Because nobody's really American. You've got to be French or German or something, British or something like that. So in any event, she was famously, the program that I was in was described as online as, quote, famously rigorous, which let me tell you this was. And I was taught to write the Russian language. This is on the left over here. This is some previous class. I don't know what it is, Greek or something. But this is Russian script. And I was taught to write the way that, that children in school are, where you remember in your elementary school classroom, there were those letters and how to form them. So this particular word means will organize or will arrange. And she was insistent about the formation of the letters, so much that when I met my wife, Elena Vladimirovna Bizanok, who's with us today, I wrote her a postcard from here in Vermont soon after we had met. I labored over this postcard, making sure that the letters were formed correctly and all the grammar was right. So I sent it to Elena and came back home and I said, what'd you think of the postcard? She said, it looks like a child's writing, which I now take as a compliment because, of course, Russians don't, you and I probably don't write the way that we were taught in school in terms of the formation of the letters, and that's true of Russians as well. But I was taught only this one way, and this is the correct way, and there's nothing else. So anyway, that was one of my teachers when I came back to college. The other was this lady, Yevgenia Pistsova, who, tongue twister, she had married a US Foreign Service officer, Robert Tucker, who was associated with the embassy in Moscow. He eventually went on to be a scholar of Stalin. He applied Freudian theories to Stalin's upbringing to show that he had a disrupted childhood, and that accounted for a lot of the outrages later on. The excesses of forced collectivization and that sort of thing, the purges of 1937. So they had gotten married, and it was 7 years before she could emigrate from the USSR. Stalin himself kept her from emigrating, the theory being that American husbands don't treat Russian wives well. I don't know, you can get a first-hand opinion over here if you choose. And it wasn't, in fact, until Stalin died that she could get out. This is a picture that was in the press at the time of her arriving in the United States. So I dealt with some very formidable personalities here in the United States. And then, again, I intended to be a research chemist, but found some time to study abroad in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. This is the Philologiczny Fakultet, Philfak, in Leningrad, at Leningrad State University, now St. Petersburg State University. It's a beautiful building. It faces on the Neva River. Directly across from here is the famous Bronze Horseman, a memorial from Catherine II, Catherine the Great, to Peter I, the founder of St. Petersburg. And one of the things that I was forced to study there was phonetics. So I had my handwriting lessons in college and then phonetics with the Russian Henry Higgins, whose name was Lyudmila Shcherebanova. So we had classes about here's how you put your tongue for this letter, here's how you put your tongue for that letter. And then she sent us off at the very end with a very Russian type farewell. She said, quote, "You all speak just as badly as when you first came here." So I actually think in my case that was maybe only partially true. But I did have trouble, I have to say, with my soft L. And it was only decades later that I got my soft L, although when I went back to Moscow, as I'll describe it, the librarian at the Higher School of Economics said, complimented me on my hard consonants. So you have to take what you can get in this business. So then I came back and through a long process, went to law school, and then started at my first job, my first real job at the US State Department. As I said, not in the Oceans, Environment, and Science part, which is basically what I teach here, having done multilateral negotiations where you speak into the microphone, your words are translated into 5 languages on ozone and toxics and acid rain, that sort of thing. But I actually started in the European Bureau because of the sometime Russia connection. So that I was actually involved in dealing with the Soviets directly during the Cold War period. And one of the things that I encountered was that when I went to the State Department, the KAL 007 incident had happened mere days before. This was, for those of you who don't remember or are not familiar with it, it was a Korean airliner that strayed into Soviet airspace over Kamchatka and was shot down. Everybody aboard perished, including a US member of Congress, a congressman. But one of the points of this is that during the Cold War, there was a complicated minuet that was understood where both, as the Russians would say, sides, storony, knew what the steps were. And they've been, I think, largely forgotten now, although I can tell you that two people on the planet do know them very well. One is Joseph Biden, the other is Vladimir Putin. So, but this did not trigger World War III, which I think is an important piece of learning for the moment. I was responsible, among other things, for Berlin. I would say you may remember, except you probably don't, that Berlin was not part of the Federal Republic of Germany. It was physically located within the territory of the German Democratic Republic, which was the Soviet zone of occupation of Germany. And it was split into 4 sectors, the 4 powers, the 4 victorious powers in World War II, in Europe at least. So the French, British, and US sectors, I refuse to say American because Canadians are American, as are Brazilians. So my students are taught to say United Statesians. But there's the French, British, and US sectors, which were colloquially known as West Berlin, and then the Soviet sector, which was East Berlin, and this red line here is the wall. But both sides had to deal with each other all the time about very practical issues, including the air corridors. The Soviets were constantly changing the air corridors. You probably haven't thought much about this, but the air corridors are not where, they weren't an area where, say, Pan Am was allowed to fly. It was an area where Pan Am was prohibited from flying. And the Soviets wanted to keep airplanes up above a certain level so that if they were to crash or who knows what else in the territory of East Germany, they would cause less rather than more harm. That required, they were constantly changing them, and it required a rapid descent into Tempelhof Airport, which was the only airport in West Berlin at the time. But the point is that this is another example of the minuet and the relationship between the two sides that eventually had to accommodate each other. That has, again, I think, largely been forgotten. The Soviets actually had a term for it, a theoretical term, which was peaceful coexistence. You may have heard of it. In Russian, it's mирное сосуществование. It's really a tongue twister. The peaceful coexistence, which meant getting along with countries that we really can't stand, and that is from the Soviet side. We really can't, we don't agree with them, we really can't stand, but they exist and we have to accommodate them somehow. So fast forward several decades, and I find myself, along with Elena, in Moscow, where I was the first Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Sustainable Development. Interestingly, the notion of sustainable development had penetrated to the Fulbright office in Moscow. It was actually the head of the office that came up with this particular fellowship, because he thought the concept of sustainable development would be useful to the Russian Federation. And these are my students there. The reason I put this picture in is that it's not obvious to you, nor should it be, but there are many nationalities that are pictured here. Obviously Russians, but there's also at least one Kazakh student, one Uzbek. I mean, you know, if you kind of know what to look for, you can maybe see it. And also at least one Belarusian and one Ukrainian. And you know, all of these students work together. I don't even know what passports they had, because it was none of my business. But the Uzbek and the Kazakh students may very well have had Russian passports and may very well have been Russian citizens. It wasn't an issue that came up. And there was a lot of mixing during the Soviet period, which you can see in this picture. Also, I always get a laugh when I say this, but I look at them as a group, and what I see are a lot of free spirits. That sounds strange when you're talking about Russians, but they're you can see just from the way that they're dressed that they're all different, and they all have their own, each one has his or her own style. Some of them work in fancy law firms, some of them work in public interest and nonprofits. There's a lot of mixing, particularly among younger people, where these sorts of national distinctions don't make much of a difference, at least not among my students that I saw ever. So 2017, so it's recent. I just wanted to quickly, as a little bit of cultural background, discuss the etymological origin of Ukraine, which is this Russian preposition "u," which means at, kind of like chez in French. If you say at my house in Russian, it's "u меня." It can also be used for other purposes. And krai, which has the meaning of, one of the meanings that it has is edge. So this is not a happy description for a country that's at the edge of something that presumably is at the center. You put them together, you get Ukraine. And and I was taught by David Sloan and Veronika Jolinka, et cetera, to say, unlike every other country on the planet, to say on Ukraine, na Ukrainie, on, and I put the in there because it used to be standard in English. My theory is, I don't know, it hasn't been proven, that the that used to come before Ukraine, like the Sudan, was a result of this etymological origin. Now, in English, it's no longer standard to say the Ukraine, although you will catch, if you pay close attention on CNN, you will catch foreign correspondents saying it from time to time. We all need to be reconstructed. And in Russian, you no longer say on Ukraine, the accepted form is v, in, the way every other country. So I'm sure my mother-in-law still says na Ukrainian, but and it requires a certain amount of reprocessing, even for me as a non-native speaker, to take that formula out. But the purpose of this is to show you that language has consequences, and it has implications for current situations such as the current one. And let me choose another one that I didn't, for obvious reasons, put on the PowerPoint. When I was in Leningrad, and I've checked this with native speakers, not just my wife, but also others, a huge issue in Leningrad is the blockade, the 900 days, and I mean a horrible human rights violation in which many people perished. I mean, it's unthinkable. And that was always attributed to the fascisti, to the fascists. And it was pretty obvious that when you were talking about the fascists, you were not talking about the Italians. It was strictly the Germans who had ringed the city and were bombing. You can still go there and see signs on buildings that say, citizens, during a bombing, stay away from this side of the street because the bombs are more likely to fall here than they are on the other side. So, and now you hear Putin talking about Nazis, nazisti. Totally unknown to the Russian language, at least in my experience, and again, native speakers have confirmed this. So language gives some insights into this overall conflict. Okay, so what I'd like to do, this is the analytical part of the presentation, just to give you a sense of the international law governing the use of armed force. Second of all, the unraveling of the 1989 legal order, and then last, the environmental consequences. So human beings, since at least the beginning of the Christian era, St. Augustine and even before that, have attempted to regulate and control the worst consequences of war. And that, if I had been giving this presentation a century ago, I would have been describing war, that is the use of armed force, as a legitimate tool of foreign policy, not that that's my personal view, but as a legitimate tool of foreign policy that was appropriate under some circumstances. There was a law of retortions and reprisals and retaliation and which box you put each of those actions in. All of that was wiped out at the end of the Second World War with the adoption of the UN Charter. So basically, the basic rule of the UN Charter is that all use of armed force is prohibited and allowed under only two circumstances. The first is as approved by the Security Council, which is a 15-member executive body of the United Nations with the 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Russian Federation as the successor to the USSR, and the People's Republic of China. The veto is not actually written into the charter as such, rather there's a specification that actions taken of the sort that we're talking about under Chapter 7 must be approved by all 5 of the permanent members. That's in effect a veto. So after 1945, with the adoption of the charter and the Security Council's consideration of these issues, the Soviets learned a very hard lesson, which was during the debate on what became the Korean War, not to walk out and have a cup of tea or whatever they were doing. That was held by the chair to be an abstention, and so the Korean War actually got approved by the Security Council over what would have been the Soviet veto. Fast forward several decades, Soviets having learned their lesson, and other states as well, weren't the only ones to use the veto. The first time that Chapter 7 was successfully invoked after that to address threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. So in other words, not just in a defensive mode, but this is more a police action, where the United Nations, on behalf of all of us, all 193 member states, are acting to constrain breaches of the peace, threats to the peace, and acts of aggression. The first one after Korea was the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein by Iraq. The timing of this is not coincidental. It's the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the restructuring of the Soviet Union, the perestroika period. Public international lawyers such as myself were beside themselves with ecstasy that the Security Council was actually now going to work the way it should. Now, what was originally anticipated was that member states such as the United States would contribute military forces, that is uniformed armed forces, to a multilateral command headed up by the United Nations and as structured by special agreements. The number of special agreements that has been negotiated is 0. So what evolved is that what's sometimes called Article 42.5 of the UN Charter is that the Security Council would delegate the task of addressing threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, acts of aggression, to a coalition of the willing. You probably heard the term. This is the first time when there was actually a police action undertaken on behalf of the multilateral police action undertaken by at the leadership of the United States to expel Saddam Hussein in Iraq from Kuwait. And it was enormously successful. The code language is all necessary means in a UN Security Council resolution. You can read it with respect to the 1991 invasion of expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. I mean, this is a very strange undertaking. The starting date was predetermined. It was January 15th, 1991. It was my first year of teaching, and I was teaching a course that engaged with this, and I was in a mad scramble to get everything pulled together for the students. But the only war that I know of that had a predetermined starting date. So I came home, turned on the television, and you can see the bombs falling in Baghdad, more or less as was anticipated by the framers of the UN Charter. Since then, it hasn't gone particularly well. So we have Afghanistan, which was not approved by after 9/11, which was not approved by the Security Council. Iraq 2003, which was most definitely not approved by the Security Council, and many states on the planet regard it as an illegal act. So for instance, I have a friend who is an ex-US expat living in London, who tells me that Tony Blair, who, if you recall, explicitly supported George W. Bush in this enterprise. I was actually in London at the time and heard him speak. He wasn't physically there, but there was a big loudspeaker at Green Park saying we have to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he's such a bad guy. My friend tells me, and this is not my personal opinion necessarily, but that Tony Blair is now regarded as a war criminal within the United Kingdom. So the system has not worked recently as expected. The alternative has been to turn to the General Assembly under what was called and still is, the Uniting for Peace resolution. But that doesn't give the Security Council imprimatur that's required under Chapter 7. So for instance, during, I think it was after Iraq, I remember being in a public place and seeing Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time, coming out of a Security Council meeting and saying, well, you know, this resolution was taken under Chapter 7. And she looks meaningfully into the camera and says, and we all know what that means. What it means is authorization for the use of armed force. Okay, so that's, and the theory here is that the Security Council is a sieve, is a screen. Only the most meritorious actions will get through because states, as we know from history, are tempted all the time to engage in military operations out of self-interest, out of short-term needs, a variety of other concerns that are not consistent with the public good, the global public good. Okay, the other alternative is self-defense, which is of ancient origin well before the UN Charter. This was preserved in the UN Charter in Article 51. And the self-defense actually has a limited legal meaning. It means a response to an incursion by the uniformed military, the uniformed armed forces of a foreign state. So it must be uniformed. So for instance, 9/11 technically was not, response to 9/11 was technically not self-defense because this was not the regular armed forces of a foreign state. Rather, it was a group of loosely structured terrorists. I mean, obviously they caused a lot of, they caused gross devastation, but technically speaking, it does not qualify as self-defense. The other is, and I have to look at my notes here to make sure I get this right, historically, there is a requirement that the response must be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. In other words, has to be in the moment. The notion of anticipatory self-defense is not consistent with the ancient legal doctrine. Interestingly, it was a dispute in 1837 between the United States and the United Kingdom when there was an uprising in Canada, and the British took a U.S. warship and actually literally sent it over Niagara Falls. And the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Daniel Webster, protested that this was not self-defense, and in fact, the British agreed. So One of the other important points is pay attention to how law is made in this system. There's no legislature, there's no pace Jenny, there's no administrative law. It's a very decentralized system in which custom and practice and behavior in the past plays an immensely important role. Okay, so this is called, up to this point, we're talking about jus ad bellum, whether an intervention is legal up front. Now, there's a second incredibly important body of law called jus in bello. That is the law that applies in a situation of armed conflict. And the principal point here is it doesn't matter how you got there, you still need to observe it. The responses need to be necessary, proportional. The variety of treaties that deal with appropriate responses, including those that limit the use of chemical and biological weapons, and the all-important humanitarian law, which includes a prohibition on civilian targets, prohibition on non-combatants, prohibitions on genocide, and a variety of other legal constraints. Now you can say, okay, well, it's war, it's chaos, but this is the law that, and it's undisputed that these principles apply to every situation in which armed force is being deployed. Okay, the Russian Federation, when I was there in 2017, I was teaching public international law to that same cohort of students. The theory was that the Russian Federation was becoming integrated into the community of nations. Since then, things have not gone particularly well. So the Russian Federation joined the World Trade Organization, and the US, in retaliation for Ukraine, initiated a withdrawal of most favored nation status. The Russian Federation joined the Council of Europe and became a party to the European Convention on Human Rights. And in 2022, this year, it announced its withdrawal from the Council of Europe. The Russian Federation accepted jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and in 2022 boycotted proceedings that were initiated by Ukraine. It signed the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and in 2016 it expressly declined to ratify withdrawing signature. So the point of this collection of slides is that one sees the unraveling of the international legal order as a result of Ukraine and of the Ukraine special military operation and other factors. As one of the points here is it doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it war, you can call it special military operation. If it involves you can call it phantasmagoria if you want. It doesn't matter what you call it. So long as it involves the use of armed force, it's governed by this law. So as one of my numerous Russian teachers one time quipped, quote, "In Russian, you never want to be special." Think about it. And then it was also thrown off the UN Human Rights Council. So to get to the environmental piece, we know that there are lots of emissions of heavy metals, toxic gases, particulates from missile strikes. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was occupied by Russian forces at the very beginning, and the workers there were held basically hostage and prohibited from leaving. There were also grave concerns about the potential release of radiation. This is a picture of Chernobyl with the sarcophagus around it, which is sort of a choice of last resort, funded by the European Bank, in part, by the way, quite some time ago, just to contain this literally radiation hotspot. Greenhouse gas emissions, I haven't been able to find particularly good numbers about an increase in emissions that can be attributed to the special military operation. But both Ukraine and the Russian Federation are parties to the Paris Agreement. I've spoken about that in previous years. Both of them have reduction contributions, they're called. You're not supposed to call them commitments because they're not legally binding. But interestingly, the Ukrainian one, even pre-special military operation, said that we are undertaking a significant reduction of 40%, notwithstanding Russian aggression. This is pre-special military operations, so we're talking about Crimea, Sevastopol, Donbass, in the emissions there included. Okay, so just a few more sources of law, and then we'll take questions. The International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion in 1996, gave a very helpful template for thinking about the environment in an armed conflict. This is in an advisory opinion. Those of you who teach constitutional law teach your students very, very well. I can say from prior experience that advisory opinions, no way. Well, let me tell you, in the International Court of Justice, yes way. The advisory opinions are fairly routinely rendered. This was at the request of states motivated by non-governmental organizations such as Physicians for Nuclear Responsibility. And the ICJ explicitly said that all of the law that is taught in international environmental law that I taught here for more than a decade explicitly applies to armed conflict. What it did conclude is that that doesn't necessarily mean that every state needs to get rid of its nuclear arsenal. And you can say, well, that's sort of, how do you reconcile them? We can talk about that if you want. But the law applies even in armed conflict, including all of that humanitarian law, et cetera. Additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. This is the principal source of humanitarian law. The prohibits methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. The Russian Federation withdrew its 1992, in effect, signature, another example of unraveling. Another convention dealing with environmental modification techniques. There was a question beforehand, what is this picture? The answer is it's a vessel sent out into the ocean. This falls in the category of geoengineering for climate. Sent out in the ocean that would spray particulates in the form of sulfur sulfates into clouds to reflect light back into the atmosphere. So I was just at a meeting where we were talking about having speakers come in to talk, and I said, well, maybe we should get somebody on geoengineering like this. And the response was, well, that's like, I am on tape, but that's like inviting the tobacco industry to a conference on lung cancer. So, not my personal view, but in any event, that's what this is: purposeful environmental modification with malintent. That's an important component of the doctrine. The customary international law, this is what we teach in international environmental law. This is a smelter in Trail, British Columbia, that gave rise to basically the entire discipline and a prohibition on transboundary pollution. The point here is that the law accretes not from treaties, which are contracts, but from the behavior of states over time. International criminal law, the distinguishing feature is individual liability. Think Slobodan Milosevic. This is the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And the proposal now is to extend the term to a new crime called ecocide. And there's a small working group that is putting that together. The Russian Federation, as I said earlier on, is not a party to the Rome Statute. Neither is Ukraine or the United States, but there is a possibility of a customary accretion. And then last, one of the criticisms one hears about public international law is that, well, it's not enforceable. Some skepticism is appropriate. On the other hand, there are precedents that are, in fact, quite effective. In fact, after the 1991 Persian Gulf War, in which Saddam Hussein was expelled from Kuwait, there was a UN compensation commission put together, established by the Security Council, that awarded $52.4 billion to about 1.5 million successful claimants. If you remember, and even if you don't, the retreating Iraqi forces actually lit fire. That's the picture well, it was supposed to be the picture in the background. They actually lit fire to oil wells, causing a huge amount of pollution, and there was indeed a meaningful remedy there. So I will stop and invite questions. The one question that I would not invite, which is, please tell me how all of this turns out. I'm not any better at that than anybody else in the room. But otherwise, I'm more than happy to take questions, and thank you very much for coming today.
So I am happy to take questions both online on YouTube or via Facebook, or to take questions from the room. So any questions from the room to start?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate I need to be a little bit circumspect, but this particular one is not a problem. Let me expand the question a little bit, which is to invite a perspective from how the rest of the world, that is other than the Russian Federation, that is other than Ukraine, and other than we ourselves here in the United States, might think about this situation. And the answer is with considerable skepticism. I mean, the more frequently heard analogy is with the 2003 Iraq War, which was, like this one, a war of discretion, right? It was a war that was unprovoked. And so you get countries like India looking at the behavior of the United States over time, Spanish-American War, and saying, well, you know, the U.S. at least arguably appears to be a bit disingenuous about this situation. So, yeah, I think that there's some traction there, and probably the best recent example is the 2003 Iraq War. What I've tried to do in this presentation is to deliver the law as neutral principle, right? How it looks. Whether there was an appropriate motivation or not, the law doesn't care about any of that. And so these are principles that we can all refer to. Ukraine is entitled to the right to self-defense, both individual and collective. NATO is Ukraine is not as is well known, is not a NATO member, but NATO is a collective security pact of a type that's ancient. I mean, you can find them in the Bible. So that's clear. This is an incursion that's undertaken by the regular armed forces of a foreign state in violation of the Charter, Article 2.4, which specifies the territorial integrity of all states. So I think that if you look at examples like the one that you gave or the 2003 Iraq War, one can explain the political behavior of foreign states. And the law obviously doesn't live in an entirely different universe, but it also helps to clarify objectively the legality of the situation. I mean, that's not I don't think anybody would have a complete answer to the question, but hopefully that gives you some insights. If you listen to those from other countries, they look at the U.S. behavior with some degree of skepticism as to whether, as the question implies, as to whether it is consistent over time.
Couple questions from me. The first related to the UN Security Council. It seems strange to have it populated majority with permanent members. And I noticed that none of the countries you listed are in the Global South. And so I wondered, what are the implications of that? I'm not very familiar, other than what you told us, with the Security Council, and what does it take to change that? And then my second question is, doesn't it hurt Russians living in Russia to risk radiation leakage from Chernobyl?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, the Security Council, what it is, it's a 15-member body. Most international organizations have some subset as an executive body. So it's 15 members, 5 permanent members. The other members are elected and they rotate. So there has been considerable concern about the continued presence of the Russian Federation on the Security Council, including, I believe, at least one individual who is watching this presentation online. So there's been a lot of attempt to find a principled basis for removing, for instance, the Russian Federation from the Security Council. I mean, this issue has been around for a long time. Security Council reform would require a pretty heavy lift in terms of an amendment to the UN Charter. I'm not saying that it's out of the question. But for instance, you saw this during the debate in the Security Council. It was televised at the very beginning of the special military operation, so that there was the Russian ambassador to the Russian Federation's ambassador to the United Nations, who was responding to the Ukrainian ambassador's point. The Ukrainian ambassador's point was that Russia should no longer be allowed to sit on the Security Council because it is no longer a peace-loving state, which is a standard that's contained in the Charter. The International Court of Justice has held that that is and since we're all lawyers here, you'll understand this, a non-justiciable test. Whether a state is peace, what's the standard? But if you recall that juncture, I mean, that confrontation was delivered with considerable vigor from Ukraine. But the law is the law, at least until it's changed. It would be a fairly heavy lift to change the composition of the Security Council. It would probably require the consent of the Russian Federation. I don't want to commit myself on that necessarily, but it's a challenge. Then the second point about Chernobyl, at least the news reports that I've seen, are that these young men, by the way, going back to my picture of the students, the young men in that picture routinely went off. They're all members of the reserves. They all went off to weekend training. I mean, I sincerely hope not, but it's possible that some of them may have been deployed to Ukraine, and it's possible that some of them may no longer be with us. I mean, these are conscripts. So which obviously causes, the thought of it is very troubling to me. And but from what I've heard is that a lot of these soldiers didn't know what they were doing. I mean, they're just taking orders and doing what they're told to do without necessarily a great awareness of what that consists of. I mean, what do they know from Chernobyl? I mean, they're just told to go to this particular place. But one other point, and this goes back to the students and Mrs. Dolinka and everything else, the two cultures are very close. I mean, it's kind of like United States and Canada or something, and the languages are said to be close. I don't speak Ukrainian, and I certainly can't understand it. But the languages are close. The people have been integrated for a very long time. Russian civilization began with Kievskaya Rus from Kiev, and then was transplanted to Moscow, and then ultimately to St. Petersburg under Peter the Great. So, I mean, unraveling these two cultures and the two nationalities is something that's fundamentally an undoable task. So I don't. But my guess is that I wouldn't assume that the Russian soldiers that went into Chernobyl necessarily knew what they were doing. I mean, I'd want to see that demonstrated as opposed to assumed. And by the way, obviously the exposure is potentially very great.
Right. Okay, I think we'll just take one more question. This is from YouTube, from Carlos Sanchini. thanks, David, and compliments. During a conference discussing the introduction on constitutional principles regarding sustainable development and so on, someone said international law is at zero discussions in these days at EU Parliament. Show that environmental protection legislation goes on, but with difficulties. What are your ideas and suggestions on that?
That environmental legislation goes on, but with challenges. I mean, I think that that's always been the situation since before 1970 and the first Earth Day. So that the notion of sustainable, by the way, hi, Carlo. Thanks for attending. The, not so by the way, but yes, it's a challenge. I mean, that's what Vermont Law School stands for. We're here to be collective, as my picture of the Eiffel Tower said, when the Paris Agreement was adopted, and to join forces. Maybe this is a positive, aspirational note to end this presentation on. And I think we can move forward. One of the interesting features of this situation, particularly with respect to greenhouse gases, is if you listen to what President Biden has said. He said, okay, we're interested in renewables, we're interested in combating climate disruption, et cetera, but not necessarily right now. Now we have to deal with the needs of our European allies who are maybe being cut off from Russian gas and that sort of thing. So I think that's a good example of exactly what Carlo was talking about, which is that, yes, there are setbacks from time to time. On the other hand, the broader frame is hopefully in the direction of more sustainability. The problem with respect to greenhouse gases is that we don't have a lot of time. The window is closing. The budget, as demonstrated by the United Nations emissions gap reports, we're rapidly consuming the budget of greenhouse gases that we have before hitting a tipping point. This obviously doesn't help. I mean, the special military operation, the war in Ukraine, is associated with obviously increases in greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, I don't know exactly, I haven't been able to find reliable numbers, but there is also the very important effect of lost time. So we all need to be here working collectively, contributing our individual and group will towards working towards sustainability over time. Hopefully that will see us through.
Thank
Is there
you.
time for one more question?
Okay.
Well, and also, you know, at a much lower level, myself, having been participant, the point is that they were participants in crafting these dance steps and the understanding about what's acceptable. Vietnam is acceptable. Angola, Mozambique are acceptable. Direct incursions. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the question. Well, right. Well, first of all, I say this as without any factual backup whatsoever, but as a former State Department employee, I guarantee you that channels of communication are open between the White House and the Kremlin, number one. Number two, my point was actually a more limited one, which dealt with the threat of nuclear war and the possibility of World War III. It's, as to that, there's some disagreement in our family about this, but as to that, I'm actually somewhat hopeful because you have individuals and the institutional memory on both, as the Russians would say, sides, storoны, that about how we avoid the worst possible cataclysm. That's the Korean airliner, that's Berlin. So I'm not saying that there's no risk of nuclear intervention, of course not. But there are people and there are individuals and institutions that know how to deal with these situations and know how to deal with hostile nuclear armed powers. That's my principal point.
Okay, we are indeed out of time, so we'll wrap up here. Thank you again for your presentation, Professor Wirth, and to everybody who joined us here today, thank you. And our next talk will take place on Tuesday next week, so we'll see you then.
All right. Thank you very much.